Would the world still love Eleanor Rigby if it was called Miss Daisy Hawkins? And what exactly does it mean to darn one's socks in the night? Well, we'll be answering those questions and more in today's episode about Eleanor Rigby, the Beatles song that first appeared on Revolver and was also a double A-side with Yellow Submarine. The song was initially thought up by Paul McCartney, of course, but there were contributions from John Lennon as well as George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and George Martin. The emotional feel and the delivery of the song are in stark contrast to many of the songs that came before it and many of the songs that were popular at the time that it was released. You see, the Beatles had been a touring band for a long time, and by 1966, they had begun to grow extremely tired of the rigorous schedule, as well as facing the backlash they had received from John Lennon's controversial comments before. At this point, they were ready to start their journey into being more of a studio-oriented band. Eleanor Rigby has always struck me as one of the most dark and haunting yet beautiful songs that the Beatles ever released, and if one were to start from the very beginning of their catalog and work their way up, song by song, it's easy to imagine the surprise one might feel once they get to Eleanor Rigby. In fact, the first song on Revolver is George Harrison's jaunty Taxman, which is an upbeat, tongue-in-cheek, satirical song which features drums, bass, guitar, everything you'd expect from the Beatles at that point, whereas Eleanor Rigby, which follows immediately after, doesn't even feature a single Beatle playing a single instrument. No, rather, it is simply a string quartet, which was organized and led by none other than Beatles producer George Martin. Of course, Paul did use a piano to come up with the original melody, however, the piano did not end up in the final recording. Paul said he was at his girlfriend Jane Asher's house in London when he came up with the song, stating, "I wrote it at the piano, just vamping an E minor chord, letting that stay as a vamp and putting a melody over it, just danced over the top of it. It has almost Asian Indian rhythms." And it took Paul a little while for the lyrics to take shape as well. As I stated previously, the original name was Miss Daisy Hawkins. However, he felt that wasn't really quite real enough and eventually settled on Eleanor Rigby. He was inspired to use the name Eleanor from the actress Eleanor Braun, who had starred alongside the Beatles in their film Help. And the inspiration for the last name of Rigby came from a shop in Bristol called Rigby and Evans Limited Wine and Spirit Shippers, which he spotted while he was visiting Jane Asher on the set of Happiest Days of Your Life. He said, "I thought I swear that I made up the name Eleanor Rigby like that. I remember quite distinctly having the name Eleanor, looking around for a believable surname, and then wandering around the Docklands in Bristol and seeing the shop there. But it seems that up in Woolton Cemetery, where I used to hang out a lot with John, there's a gravestone to an Eleanor Rigby. Apparently a few yards to the right there's someone called Mackenzie." And in another eerie and strange coincidence, the Woolton Cemetery is adjoined to St. Peter's Church in Liverpool, and this is the exact spot where John first met Paul in 1957. And whether or not Paul was aware that there was a real-life Eleanor Rigby, she did in fact exist and was born in 1895 and lived in Liverpool. She's buried there with her grandfather and her relatives, and the gravesite has become a very popular destination to those visiting Liverpool. Paul has gone on record to claim that he's written about 80% of the song, although John has also claimed to have written about 70% of the song. What we do know is that Ringo Starr suggested that Father Mackenzie should be darning his socks in the night. And for those of you who don't know what that refers to, it basically means to sew up and fix holes in one's socks rather than to throw them out. This is what John Lennon said about the song in an interview in 1980. The first verse was his and the rest are basically mine. But the way he did it, well, he knew he had a song, but by that time he didn't want to ask for my help. And we were sitting around with Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall. So he said to us, "Hey, you guys, finish up the lyrics." Now, I was there with Mal, a telephone installer who was our road manager, and Neil, who was a student accountant, and I was insulted and hurt that Paul had just thrown it out in the aid. He actually meant he wanted me to do it. And of course there isn't a line of theirs in the song, because I finally went off to a room with Paul and we finished it. But that's the kind of insensitivity he would have, which has set me in later years. That's the kind of person he is. Here, finish these lyrics up, like to anybody who was around. Oh, he had the whole start. Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where our wedding has been. And he had the story and knew where it was going. So we had to work out, well, is there anybody else in this story? We came up with Father Mackenzie for a bit, but Paul said his dad would be upset, so we made it into Mackenzie, even though McCartney sounded better. And then we went on to new characters. It's hard to describe, even with the clarity of memory, the moment the apple falls. The thing will start moving along at a speed of its own, then you wake up at the end of it and have this whole thing on paper, you know? Who said what to whom as we were writing, I don't know. I do know that George Harrison was there when we came up with, look at all the lonely people. He and George were settling on that as I left the studio to go to the toilet, and I heard the lyric and turned around and said, that's it. Well, no matter who's responsible for the majority of the song, it's clear that there was input from everyone involved. And this is what Paul had to say about the Father Mackenzie part. I had Father McCartney as the priest just because I knew that was right for the syllables, but I knew I didn't want it even though John liked it. So we opened the telephone book, went to McCartney, and looked what followed, and shortly after, it was Mackenzie. I thought, oh, that's good. It wasn't written about anyone. A man appeared who died a few years ago who said, I'm Father Mackenzie. Anyone who was called Father Mackenzie and had any slim contact with the Beatles quite naturally would think, well, I spoke to Paul, and he might have easily have written that about me, or he may have spoken to John and thought John thought it up. John wanted to say McCartney, but I said, no, it's my dad, Father McCartney. He said, it's good, it works fine. I agreed it worked, but I didn't want to sing that. It was too loaded. It asked too many questions. I wanted it to be anonymous. John helped me on a few words, but I'd put it down 80-20 to me, something like that. The song was indeed very successful upon its release, and although it was quite different from the other material the band had produced previously, many people praised its unconventional lyrics and song structure. The lyrics are rather poetic, with lines like, wearing the face that she keeps in a jar by the door, and it was not very common at the time to have songs written about a lonely old lady and to point out some of the flaws in society. But what exactly was it that inspired Paul to write a song with this subject matter in the first place? He said, growing up, I knew a lot of old ladies, partly through what was called Bob a Job Week, when scouts did chores for a shilling. You'd get a shilling for cleaning out a shed or mowing a lawn. I wanted to write a song that would sum them up. Eleanor Rigby was an old lady that I got on with very well. I don't even know how I first met Eleanor Rigby, but I would go around to her house, and not just once or twice. I found out that she lived on her own, so I would go around there and just chat, which is sort of crazy if you think about me being some young Liverpool guy. Later, I would offer to go and get her shopping. She'd give me a list and I'd bring the stuff back, and we'd sit in her kitchen. I still vividly remember the kitchen because she had a little crystal radio set. That's not a brand name. It actually had a crystal inside it. Crystal radios were quite popular in the 1920s and 30s. So I would visit, and just hearing her stories enriched my soul and influenced the songs I would later write. In addition to that rather heartwarming recollection, Paul was also beginning to feel a bit of dread about his own mortality, stating, I remember thinking to myself, what am I going to do when I'm 30? 30 was the big age. Will I still be in a group? I remember being round at John Dunbar's house, having a very clear vision of myself in a herringbone jacket with leather elbow patches and a pipe, thinking, Eleanor Rigby, this could be a way I could go. I could become a more serious writer, not so much a pop writer. Well, in retrospect, I think it's safe to say that Paul had very little to worry about as far as where his career would end up going, but hindsight is always 20/20, of course, and I don't blame him for having worries. But among the many cherished songs that Paul has given the world, Eleanor Rigby stands as a favorite amongst many Beatles fans, and it's been covered multiple times with some notable versions from Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin. And in 1982, the city of Liverpool was even given a gift of an Eleanor Rigby statue by an entertainer named Tommy Steele. The statue is of a bronze woman sitting on a stone bench. She's looking down at a newspaper, and on top of it sits a sparrow. On the other side is a shopping bag full of groceries. Eleanor Rigby is a powerful and tragic commentary on the alienation and isolation so many people feel, especially as they grow older, in our modern society and in large urban environments. It also questions the role and relevance of religion and traditions in our changing world. The song clearly set the stage for what was to come for the Beatles, and it wasn't too long after that they recorded Strawberry Fields Forever or I Am the Walrus, just to name a couple groundbreaking songs that further pushed their boundaries. To think that just a few years prior they were singing I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You is really rather remarkable.